in America, they have the saying that you never want to follow children and animals when you're doing an act. And after Elder McEdwards' presentation, I feel like that as well. It was a very dynamic, very engaging presentation. Unfortunately, in mine, nothing blows up, nothing explodes, and there are no pictures of wars or even rumors of wars. But, um, you know, as an attorney for the church, I remember when I was in undergraduate school at Southern Adventist University, I was talking to someone and I said, yeah, I'm going to go to law school. And at this point, there was no idea of really even working for the church. And the first thing the person said to me was, well, how can you be a lawyer and be a Christian, an Adventist? Like, these are two very different things. And like, you know, won't you have to lie? And this is not what we do as Adventists. And it is true, the church for a very long time, we've always been comfortable with doctors, right? Medical schools, Loma Linda, health ministry, right arm of the church. But sort of their companion, attorneys, we have been much less comfortable with in the church. And it is true that, you know, there is no equivalent of the right arm of the message that medical has for the legal side. But what we do and what lawyers do is absolutely critical to us. Now, earlier I was told that I got half credit for starting with this, and that is grounded in the Bible and focused on the mission. So let me put that in there. But I have a question mark there, right? Grounded in the Bible, focused on the mission. But are the lawyers really grounded in the Bible and focused on the mission? Like, how is it that lawyers are supporting this? And what I want to talk about this morning is both how having good legal representation is crucial and how to better accomplish that as leaders. Because no matter what country you're in, there is a legal component in a legal environment that we're having to work in. And we're going to talk about how we can best accomplish mission. Now, I know there's some of you out there who really question this. And see, Magdiel, do I get half credit? I started off. That really question whether or not lawyers help focus, keep us grounded in the Bible. And the part I want to focus on is focused on the mission. Because for a lot of you, you take this saying to heart from Henry VI, Part 2, Act 4, Scene 3. The first thing we do is let's kill all the lawyers. And there are days which I sort of understand where that comes from. Now, I don't know how much Shakespeare has made it into Asian culture, and I apologize for the clearly English reference, but it is kind of universal. But if you look into what's going on in that play, Dick the Butcher is the henchman of another man who's trying to get a coup going in England and wants to overthrow the king. And what they want to do is basically put their rule and tyranny in place. And what Dick the Butcher is saying here is, well, if we want to get control, if we want to put our system in place, the first thing that we have to do is kill the lawyers. Because what lawyers do is, in the right setting, is maintain order and help maintain a fair and just society. And attorneys helping the church in its work is crucial to its ability to do that mission. Because, and this is what I want to talk about, getting the legal part of our ministry wrong can lead to huge distraction, huge reputational harm, and huge financial harm. I want to talk about each of these in order, and then we're going to kind of go through a little bit more. Distraction, lawsuits, government regulators, all of those people coming after you. You can't be doing mission work if the government is coming after you and wanting to shut you down or has questions for you. Reputational harm. How, you know, if you go out and you haven't done what you're supposed to legally, and you've been challenged, accused of not paying people the correct way, accused of not protecting young and vulnerable people like you should, who's going to listen to you, right? You know, the Catholic Church has had this problem, both in the United States and worldwide, with inability to deal with its problems of a very small number of priests who abuse kids. And while that is the pendulum that started to swing the other way, it made it almost impossible for anyone to hear anything they had to say. I remember talking to one Catholic attorney, and they were going before a commission to try to get permission to build a parking lot. And the only thing that the commissioners wanted to talk about was, why are you allowing children to be abused? It's like, I'm here to talk about a parking lot. But the only thing they wanted to talk about was the abuse. Now, in this particular situation, the abuse they were talking about had happened decades before. Financial harm. This varies quite a bit around the world. Some places have systems in place for people to bring claims if they've been injured, others do not. The United States has a very robust situation, a very robust support system for harm. We had a situation where a conference in the United States had a supporting school in its territory that it didn't talk to its lawyers about, didn't follow any of the legal advice, didn't do what it was supposed to do. And the lawsuits to date against the Adventist Church that we've had to pay have been over $100 million US. $100 million US because of one school and one small conference. In fact, arguably the smallest conference in the North American division. In fact, I think, yeah, it is the smallest conference. There's a mission that's a little bit smaller, one mission in NAD. Smallest conference, $100 million. The treasurer, after this, added up the entire tithe for the records. He could go back like 40, 50 years. That settlement had exceeded all the tithe that conference had paid in its entire history. Again, you have to pay attention to the legal stuff, or you're not going to be focused on the mission. You're going to be focused on legal problems. Why do we need attorneys now? You know, back in our founding, to the best of my knowledge, Sister White has never really referenced the church and lawyers and needing them. She does talk about, you know, all things in good order and biblical quote and so forth. But why is it that lawyers are more important now than they were, say, at our founding or even decades ago? One is we are a much, much larger church now than we were, right? You know, 23 million now, something like that. And we are growing in different parts of the world. We have more industries, we have more hospitals, we have more institutions. We become a much larger organization. With become larger, it is becoming more complicated. We've also been harmed in the past because of legal counsel. I mentioned the lawsuit, but even in our founding, in the early part of the 20th century, we did not always have properties titled like we were supposed to. And if you read some of the Adventist history, when we moved from Battle Creek to Tacoma Park back in the early part of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, there was properties that we ended up having to basically buy again because they had not been titled correctly. We've had other properties around the world where, because at the time, you know, the feeling was, or the legal system was, well, there is no Adventist organization here, so we'll just title the property in the name of the missionaries. And those missionaries were fine. They were loyal Adventists. But then decades and decades later, their kids and grandkids may not be as loyal. And they may start coming up with ideas of like, oh, well, this wasn't church money. Our parents put money into this. And so therefore, you know, we own this. You don't. And so the lack of legal counsel and consulting has absolutely had a negative impact on our denomination and our church over the years, really almost from its beginning. And in certain parts of the world where we learned that lesson earlier, we have solved the property question, right? In the United States, some of the other organizations, the Episcopalians in particular, have had a decade or more of property litigation over splits in their churches and who controls the property. We have not lost a single lawsuit over property in our entire history in the United States since our founding, since the early 20th century. And that's because we learned the lesson and hold the property in the correct way and listen to the legal advice. And we're starting to see that around the world as well, where we're starting to formalize and regularize how we hold property so that we're keeping it not just for ourselves, but for generations to come, should the Lord not return. And then finally, the reason I want to talk about here is society is just more regulated, right? You know, there was a time in which you could do things the government didn't really care, or the government wasn't really paying attention to churches. They were paying attention to for-profit businesses and gave churches a pass. But now a lot of places in the world, governments they see churches, they see the membership, they see the tithe, they see the size of the organization. They're like, well, you're just like a business. And so they're more regulatory of businesses and of churches and expecting them to behave like businesses. All of this really requires you in the church and as leaders to follow legal counsel. So now, having justified my own existence, which is very convenient, let's talk about how you, in fact, can better work with your legal counsels. Let me ask you this, just by a raise of hands. I'm not going to make you stand up like Ben did yesterday. How many of you, say, in the last year, have had to work with an attorney in your capacity? Okay, a handful. It's really going to depend upon your job and sort of what your role is. Oftentimes, presidential treasury are the ones that take the lead. But again, as the church becomes more sophisticated, that need is only going to increase. So, what does it require to have a good attorney? What's the key to having a good relationship with your lawyer? First, you need to develop that relationship. Trust goes both ways, right? You've got to have somebody that you can rely on and that you're comfortable with the advice they're giving. The lawyer also needs to have trust in you, that what you tell them is accurate, that you're giving them the whole story, and that you're bringing them in at the appropriate time. And if you get the best work out of any human being, and lawyers are still human, I mean, we have jobs to do, but we still respond like any other person. And having that relationship, and that relationship needs to be forged, or should be forged, before there's a crisis. You heard before from Elder McEdward about how to act in crisis, and how much of that was talking about having positions put in place in the beginning, right? And again, it's the same for lawyers. You should have and know who you're going to call. Second, your attorney needs to understand the organization. If you're lucky, you can get a Seventh-day Adventist attorney that's an expert in this area, but many times there's not. And even if they are a Seventh-day Adventist, do they really understand the church and its structure? And I will say this is an area where Office of General Counsel, the GC, through your division, can help in educating your lawyers about the church structure, and how it works. And that's the key important thing, is knowing that relationship, developing it, and making sure they know who to call. Once you've identified who to call and you have that relationship, you need to know when to do that. Now, at the General Conference and at your division, there's in-house counsel. So I and a team of 6, when we're fully staffed, provide full-time legal advice to the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. And so, Elder Kohler, Magdiel, Elder McEdward, they can just call us up, text us, and we respond. And doesn't cost anything. Well, I should say it does cost. We get a salary, but it doesn't cost any more. Most of you will be in a position where you have outside counsel that you may have to pay. Again, but knowing when to bring them in, and even for administration, right? Knowing when to bring an OGC. We don't sit in every meeting of theirs. And so they have to identify, hey, we're talking about something, this may require OGC to weigh in. It's rarely too early to call in the lawyer, right? Rarely is it going to be like, yeah, I don't need to know about this yet. Now, the lawyer may say simply, well, that's good to know. Keep me informed. Here's some things I'll need to know, and here's when we should have the next conversation. But if your question is, should I call the lawyer now or not? Usually the answer is it's fine to call them, just understanding and putting this sort of a heads up to them. So as the situation develops, as the project you're developing, whether it be a real estate project or even a new mission project or new endeavor, they can give advice. And so even identify questions that you may not think of. Because that goes to my next point, is you don't know what you don't know. Your pastors, a lot of times, legal issues may be things that you didn't even think about, right? So for instance, we've been working on an issue lately at the General Conference about having to do a certain type of compliance with federal law about our bank accounts. And some of our people in our Treasury Department didn't even know this was on the radar. They didn't even know they had this obligation. And so OGC was like, yes, you do, and then helping them walk through that obligation and that legal position. So again, as part of that relationship, you have knowing when to call them. And then sort of related to that is, when do you bring the lawyer and start having them more actively involved? Now, for some things, this is going to be less important than others. So, for instance, One Voice 27 is a big initiative. And while OGC was at its kickoff in various places, including when your division officers met in Mexico, that evangelistic initiative has been sort of not required a lot of legal input. But as things get further down the road, it will. For instance, trademarks, and making sure that we protect our intellectual property, copyrights, making sure that we both protect the materials that we are developing, and also we're not stealing and infringing on other people's copyrights, right? Eventually, there's going to be halls that have to be rented for evangelistic series, right? If you don't have it in the church, you may want to have it somewhere else. And having the lawyers involved in that, a lawyer reviewing your contract so that it holds up, can be important. I'll tell you a quick story right now. We had a small church in the eastern part of the United States that wanted to do a Revelation seminar. And they had rented a local public middle school. And this middle school would rent itself out to the people in the community. They had a contract with them, and the contract said they could meet over this weekend. It was going to be a Friday night, Saturday, and Sunday. And they sent the flyer out. I don't have the flyer here to show you, but it was fine. It did have, it had the Lady of Babylon, so to speak. And there was a cup there and so forth, and it was talking about prophecy. And it wasn't designed to get people's attention. Well, the middle school principal got this flyer in her home because she lived in the community, and she basically said, "Not in my school." She didn't like the flyer. And she's like, "Nope, you're canceled. You can't do it in my school." Well, the problem is thousands of these flyers had gone out. They didn't really feel like they had the space and capacity in the local church. Plus, they didn't necessarily want to have it at the church because they wanted to sort of be more neutral. And so they appealed to the school board or to the school and said, "Listen, we had this contract, why can't we do this?" And they said, "Nope, we don't like this," and denied them. So they called the lawyers, right? And so we ended up reaching out to the school board and said, "Listen, we're going to have to go to court if you guys don't let us use the school." And a half hour before we were getting ready to file our lawsuit, after a bunch of back and forth, they called us up and said, "Yes, you can use it," right? So even something as simple as an evangelistic series, you got to have contracts in place and agreements in place so that at the last minute, you don't get the rug pulled out from underneath you. I don't know if that phrase translates, but that's, I think, pretty self-evident. So again, having lawyers in at the right time. Also, attorneys, especially in business deals and so forth, give more than just legal advice. Yes, this may be legal, but have you thought about this, that, and the other? And lawyers, when they're doing their job right, really sort of expand and give a full view for when you're making your decisions. No. Again, talking about this is part of having that relationship, especially when you're talking about, like, say, land acquisitions, or especially if you're dealing with someone's making a claim, for instance, like an employment claim or whatever. Surprise is the death of clients. There's a lot of things lawyers can really deal with, and bad facts we can handle and try to explain. If we are surprised by them, there is very little we can do. Again, the credibility of the organization is on the line. And so you, as a leader, need to make sure the attorney knows everything, especially the bad facts. Do not be thinking, well, I want to hold this back, or I want this, this is a little sensitive. Your lawyer is the person you've got to trust, and you've got to tell everything to. And again, an uninformed attorney is a liability for a couple of reasons. First of all, if the attorney gets burned, they're going to lose confidence in you, and they're not going to be able to represent you. Second, your attorney, they represent you. They're your voice. They're the ones that go to court and speak on behalf of you. I mean, it's one of my greatest honors in life is, who gets to speak on behalf of the church, right? Well, Elder Kohler does. Um, Elder McEdward does. Other leaders do, but I do as well. When we go into court and we file something, we're saying this is the position of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, we just don't make that up, and we don't do that on our own. But if we don't have all the information, we lose confidence. We do, the court does, and opposing counsel does. And you say, well, who cares about the other side? But if you want to settle this case and get it resolved, the other side needs to have confidence that you're people of integrity and keep your word. And if your attorney has been uninformed and keeps making sort of misrepresentations, even if it's unintentional, that's not going to go well. So also, keep information confidential, right? You can waive attorney-client privilege. This is called different things around the world, but in almost every legal environment, what you and your attorney say is the other side can't find out about it, right? But if you go out and talk about this, then other people can find out about it. In fact, it can even waive that attorney-client privilege, and your attorney could be, in certain legal jurisdictions, be forced to testify almost against you. So again, keeping that information confidential is absolutely crucial. I talked about this in the next slide here. So again, people in the church often like to sort of talk about things and give information out. But again, if there's a legal situation involved, that's important. Also, do not go around your attorney. And we've had this situation come up, especially in different cultural contexts. We had a case in one part of the world, I won't say where, and it was a fight over land, right? And so one part of this, a disgruntled part of the church, was not happy about the what was being done in closing down a school. So the leader of this disgruntled group, and we were in court fighting about this, called up the conference president and says, can't we just work this out? We don't need the lawyers. Let's just work this out together. And unfortunately, that conference president agreed to that. Didn't talk to his lawyer, didn't talk to me, didn't talk to outside counsel, and they met at some restaurant somewhere. And they went back and forth. In the conference president's mind, they didn't agree to anything. They just sat there and talked and didn't come to any agreement. But in the person's mind who he met with, they had come to an agreement. And next thing I find out about this meeting was when they filed a motion to enforce the settlement agreement. And I'm like, what is they talking about? And I called up the conference president and I'm like, you didn't actually meet with him, did you? Well, yeah, I know him and he just wanted to meet. And I thought we could do it sort of off on the side and so forth. I'm like, when you're in litigation, when you're in court, there is no off the record conversations. And now they're claiming there's a settlement agreement that they want to enforce. What did you agree to? Well, I didn't agree to anything. Well, that's not what he says. And because there were two pastors, actually a pastor and a physician, they don't know how to make sure that things get documented correctly. Lawyers, it's one of the trainings that we have is we do settlements agreements all the time, but we know how to do this in a way that, when you leave the meeting, there's no ambiguity, or at least hopefully a lot less ambiguity about what was agreed to. And when you do that, it really sort of cuts into the confidence that you have in your lawyer. It makes it more difficult to defend the case. It also sends a message to the judge and to the other side that, well, maybe you really don't have confidence in your lawyer. And that makes it multiple times harder to resolve a matter when you just don't do what they say. The other thing I will say as well is there's a lot of things you as pastors can say that could be a concession in the court system that you may not realize, right? We as humans, we like to agree with people. We'd like to, sort of, oh yeah, I understand where you're coming from, and meet people halfway. We go to law school to get that beat out of us. Well, not really. But we understand that anything that you say in these agreements can be used against you. Now, if you're going through your lawyers, there's ways to minimize that. But oftentimes, pastors and leaders don't understand what really hurts a case. There can maybe small facts that you don't think is that important, but from a legal perspective, could mean that the organization loses. I remember when I was in law school working for a firm in the summer, they had me working on a very small case. And so I was calling the client up and was talking to them and getting facts. And the client kind of kept suggesting, like, well, how about this and how about that? And what was amazing to me was that what the client thought helped them actually hurt them. And what the client didn't think was important was actually why they were going to win. Now, you can talk about why we have legal systems that are like that, but it really reinforces that unless you know the law, you often don't know what hurts you and what helps you. Also, want to talk about, finally here, as we're getting ready to wrap up, what the role is of an attorney and who the attorney represents, right? The first thing is the attorney is only an advisor. The attorneys, I'm going to make some caveats here, right? But generally speaking, the institution, the leadership, makes the final say. Now, the attorney needs to understand the organization, and this is what we were talking about in relationships, right? We have a lot of times when we hire non-Adventist lawyers, lawyers who aren't used to working with religious organizations, and they're just treating you like you were some, company, right? Like you're Coca-Cola or Microsoft or something, and giving the advice there, not understanding how churches work. But again, that advisory position means that management, and that may be the president, that may be a board, that may be a committee, make the final decision. Now, there are limits to this, right? If there's a very clear law that's in place and we don't have a good reason to challenge that law, then yeah, it's coming up with, we're going to just violate the law without a really good reason is not something that, that management normally should be doing. There are exceptions. So for instance, right now, the General Conference, we're headquartered in the state of Maryland, right? And there's employment laws there. And right now, the state of Maryland is saying that the General Conference, for a lot of hourly positions and positions that aren't elected and you aren't passed, don't require pastors, that you have to hire non-Seventh-day Adventists for those. And for the General Conference, I don't know how it is in your territory, but all of our people, our administrative assistants, our building people, our IT people, our developers, all of those have to be faithful Seventh-day Adventists. And the state of Maryland said, no, you can't do that. And so we're suing the state of Maryland right now. Arguably, we're violating Maryland state law, but we're doing this in a way that we're challenging the law, and we're hopeful that we'll win. But again, management is doing this hand in hand with the attorneys to make sure that we have the most and best chance of prevailing. And so understanding that role, again, the attorneys and the lawyers do not run the organization, and they shouldn't. But they are advisors, and if you have ones that you respect, you would listen to them most of the time. The last thing I want to talk about, and this has been a big issue, is they represent the institution, not you. They're not your personal lawyers. Their duty, just like yours, goes to the union, to the mission, to the conference, to the division, whoever. And that can be a pretty big deal. I'm not going to go into details with this, but back in the 1990s, there was a General Conference president, right, who ended up having to resign. And a big part of why he had to resign was there was lack of clarity of who the attorneys represented. Did they represent him? Did they represent the organization? And we've had to clear that up over the time that, in fact, they represent the organization, not you. So this last one says questions, but it'll actually be the questions that are on the board. As I sort of wrap up here, I just want to say, I know that sometimes working with attorneys can be frustrating, but it is necessary if you want to stay focused on your mission and focused on what you're doing, you need to not be distracted by legal complications and legal problems. And there is nothing, really not much of anything, that can derail an organization than serious legal problems. And all of a sudden, you're focused on the legal issues instead of focusing on the mission and focusing on what you're doing. And, in a lot of countries, of course, and you know this better than I do, you get too far side of the law, they'll just run you out of the country. And so I encourage you as leaders, work with your attorneys, develop relationships, and understand how they can help you further your mission as organizations. So with that, I want to thank you. I think we're going to bring the